Children of day and night always respected, and at the same time despised each other. Their battles, which began in the era of myths, were transferred to people, and they still continue in our time. Even ugly villains living in hell dream of heaven, said the evil clown. He was surrounded by police and military, and he shouted to them that they were in for a terrible and exciting welcome in heaven. He took to the skies on a giant inflatable balloon and announced that Ralph's show was about to begin. One of the commanders shouted to the others that they must retreat immediately. And at that moment, Ralph the clown activated his magical death ball ability and aimed it down at the crowd. There was an explosion, and when the smoke cleared into the air, Ralph, with a satisfied smile, making a pantomime of the camera with his fingers, said to himself that the view was simply excellent. One of the surviving military men pointed a gun at the clown. Ralph noticed this and created a bat in his hands. Then he said that, despite the situation, there will always be children who have not yet figured out what is what. He swung his mace and fired a shot, wishing the man a good trip, after which a second powerful explosion occurred. Ralph the clown's assistants, bandits and robbers, who were also partially painted as clowns, or who hid their faces behind black masks, staged a pogrom in the bank. After the robbery, they went outside. A school bus drove by and parked near the stop. Then Ralph and his retinue decided to occupy the bus and leave on it. Ralph landed near the others, and taking a wad of money from his bag, enjoyed the smell of it, which he considered very sweet. He then said that he would use the money to fill Ralph Land with fear and terror. Two bandits began knocking on the doors of the bus, demanding that the driver open them as soon as possible. When the door opened, they saw that the driver was a man with a mask on his face. Perhaps it was a member of their gang. They asked him why the door took so long to open. The driver replied that this is not a sports car, but a school bus, and the doors of such a vehicle open slowly. Then he asked those who entered what kind of woman was with them. One of the bandits replied that it was a hostage. Then the driver asked why the child was also needed. They said that it was their princess, the daughter of the governor, and the woman was his wife. They caught the mother and daughter, expecting a huge ransom for them. The woman pulled her hands away, fell to her knees, and with tears in her eyes began to beg for her daughter to be released. The bandit grabbed her again and ordered her to shut up. The girl stretched out her hands to her mother and cried bitterly. She screamed back at her, calling her by name Jessica. The man who held Jessica in his arms said that if she did not obey, he would do something bad to her. The driver approached them and demanded that they let the child go. The next minute, he grabbed the guy who was holding Jessica by the face and repeated his words again. The second robber let the woman go and asked the driver what he thought he was and what he was doing. There are people in this world with special abilities. They awaken them and commit crimes while being controlled by their own desires. And those who have the blood of the child of the night are called villains. Ralph fired several shots into the air and told his team as he headed towards the bus that it was time to go back and celebrate to the fullest. As soon as the clown touched the door handle, suddenly the windows of the bus were broken, and one of the bandits who was inside flew out through the broken windows. Besides the villains, there were also people with superpowers who fought against them, those who stand on the side of society and receive support. Those who have the blood of the day are psychers. The driver got off the bus and abandoned the second bandit. Ralph pointed his finger at him and asked who he was. The guy took off the mask from his face and told the clown that he just came here to throw out the trash. It was a psycher named Cassian Lee, and he had long-standing scores to settle with Ralph. He told the enemy that they had not seen each other for a long time, for a whole year, and was glad to meet. Last time, the clown barely escaped him, and now, being trapped and not knowing where to run, he was in a real panic. The next day was quiet and calm. Ordinary people lived as if nothing had happened, went to work and other matters. The TV news channel reported that a robbery on Fifth Avenue yesterday afternoon was criticized for the use of excessive force. The Human Rights Commission formally requested the participation of LAMPAS. LAMPAS is an international organization of psychers, stating that the ace psycher Cassian, who had used ruthless violence, needed to be punished accordingly. In LAMPAS's Washington office, Cassian was summoned for a conversation with his superiors. The superior person was a girl named Two-Fence Schiller. Sipping tea and looking at Cassian's dossier and report, she asked if he was a villain. "Why do you have to be so cruel?" Cassian, crumpling the plastic cup in his hand, said that he wouldn't just mess with them. Then the girl asked him in response, did he even think about the consequences? Due to his disobedience, He ended up losing Ralph and turning the public against their organization. Cassian said in his defense that the bandits had hostages. Schiller told him that in this case he had to be as careful as possible. Hostage safety is the organization's top priority. Cassian spread his hands and said that he thought he could save them. Tufen sternly said that in addition to talking, you also need to do it. In other words, act rationally and calmly. And you can't do the damn thing headlong. The girl demanded that Cassian look at what he had done and asked how his actions differed from the villains. After making notes on the file, Schiller eventually informed Cassian that he had been placed on probation, and if he made another mistake like that, he would lose his job. Going out into the corridor, the guy called Schiller a real witch. He didn't understand how his friend Jeff was able to make friends with this girl and find a common language. He decided to go outside to clear his head, and at that moment Jeff called on the phone. He told his friend to urgently fly to him to meet. Cassian asked where he needed to go and was very surprised that he had to fly to Rhodes, a city located in Greece. But nevertheless, without any thought, he ran to help his friend and boarded the plane. Arriving at the place, on the way, Cassian thought about his friend. He had many good memories thanks to Jeff. He didn't even remember the last time they saw each other. It seemed like 6 months had already passed. They lived in the NS orphanage. Jeff, already a teenager, the eldest of the children, having learned his magical abilities, controlled various animals, entertaining the younger ones. They floated in the air and danced, and the kids laughed. Little Cassian was the most delighted. When he first saw such toys, he asked the elder if they were alive. Jeff replied, "Who, of course not. They were just toys that moved thanks to his power." Then Cassian said that Jeff could become a psyker, he would kill villains, and he would even be shown on TV. Jeff sighed and replied that his power was pretty useless. This was before Jeff was adopted into the US. There was a time then when Cassian truly knew no fears. He continued to reminisce about the good days while sipping his tea with a smile. After tea, he looked at the time. The phone showed 7:30. Jeff was late, and besides, he didn't answer phone calls. Something is wrong here. Cassian's name was called. He turned around and saw Jeff in front of him, holding his side. He was wounded and bleeding. The guy ran up to his friend and began to support him with his hands so that he would not fall. He asked the newcomer what happened, what villains attacked him. The man said that he regretted calling Cassian. He shouldn't have done it. And he handed the medallion to his friend, telling him to hide it. He didn't have time to finish the sentence and began coughing up blood. Then, Jeff, in a panic, grabbed Cassian by the shoulders and said that there was no time to explain. He had to get out of here as quickly as possible. After all, if he doesn't make it in time, he will be in danger. Cassian asked his friend to calm down and said he would call an ambulance now. Walking towards them was a man wearing black clothes and a mask that completely covered his face. The guy asked who it was, and Jeff, seeing him over Cassian's shoulder, was horrified. He stood up abruptly and pushed his friend to the side. At that moment, the masked man swung his sword and hit Jeff in the neck. Cassian froze and crawled to his friend on his knees, begging him to wake up, but it was too late. Then he looked up and saw that the masked man was already running away from the crime scene, jumping from one roof of the building to another. Cassian ran after him, shouting various insults so that he would hear them and stop. They ran to the shore, a fortress, behind which a cliff into the sea began. It was already night outside. Cassian leaned over to catch his breath. He then asked the stranger if this was some kind of revenge against his friend, or if someone had hired him. But then, clenching his fists, he added that, in principle, he didn't need a reason, and this man would still die by his hand right now. The man took off his mask and told Cassian that he was still sharp-tongued. In front of him was Jack Khaled, one of their experienced psychers. Cassian asked him how he could kill Jeff. Fury began to boil in him, having learned that it was not the hands of some villain, but one of his comrades. Jack replied that he had only eliminated a traitor to the organization. Cassian didn't believe it and called it nonsense. A girl with long white hair came up behind him and said that it was true. Jeff killed their colleague, there were witnesses and evidence. Lampas confirmed everything and gave them permission to eliminate Jeff. The girl's name was Layla. She controlled the ice, and during the conversation, she fingered the pieces of ice in her hand. Jack asked Cassian if he wanted to be recognized as a traitor too. If he still doesn't want to, then he must tell them everything. Everything he knew about Jeff, what they talked about the last time, and what he conveyed to him. Cassian sighed and said that in all the 10 years that Jeff had been a psyker, he had not killed a single person. Therefore, He did not believe that his friend could do something to one of their colleagues. Layla said that there were two more high-class psychers nearby. So Cassian must think with his head and not be stupid. Jack told the guy that if he was a real psycher, he should be reasonable, and warned him one last time. Cassian smiled and said that they were right. Since he was a psycher, he should act like a psycher, rationally and calmly. And the next moment, activating the power of fire, he shouted that he would kill them all. Jack tried to hit the guy with his sword, but his fire fists were faster. They jumped in different directions, and then Jack called on the abilities of the soul of the sword, and Lila called on the explosion of cold. Cassian ran towards them, and Lila, covering Jack, reflected the enemy's flames with her ice. And at that moment, a bullet flew into the guy's chest. It was Lila's doing. She turned out to be a sniper. The girl told Cassian to surrender, and if he did not obey them, they would be forced to eliminate him. Cassian activated one of his most powerful abilities, Hellfire, and shouted at his enemies to try it. At the same moment, there was a huge explosion. Lila and Jack were right in the middle of the flames, but managed to stay on their feet despite the explosion. Cassian jumped in the other direction to get away from them. But as soon as he jumped towards the sea, the pain from the shot went through his body, and all his arms and legs went numb. He began to fall into the sea, bleeding. Going to the bottom, he thought that he couldn't just die. He definitely needed to take revenge. The medallion that Jeff had previously given him hurt him. The eye of the pendant opened, and the next moment, Cassian woke up in the toilet in another body. This body belonged to a teenager who was forced by other students to plunge his head into a toilet and keep it in the water until he stopped breathing. They, confident that the guy was no longer alive, left the toilet, and then Cassian climbed out of the toilet and began to breathe greedily. When he realized what had just happened, because a minute ago he was at the bottom of the sea, he began to look around in shock, with wide eyes. The medallion hung around his neck and shone blue. Cassian rose to his feet and wondered where he was and what had become of his voice. He looked in the mirror and saw that his appearance had changed. He was a completely different person, and a teenager at that. He began to wash himself, telling himself that it was just a dream. He hoped that the water would wake him up and bring him to his senses, and he would wake up in his body, as he always was. But that did not happen. At that moment, the memories of the owner of the body began to awaken in his head, about how he lived, how bullies bullied him at school, and how he recently died in a toilet stall. He also learned his new name, Kwon Kang-woo, who lives in Korea. Did he really move from Greece to Korea? How did this happen? He didn't even understand what kind of memories were flashing through his head. The eye on the medallion sparkled, and a strange voice told Cassian that he had finally woken up. The guy began to look around, but there was no one in the room, and then he asked out loud, "Who was talking to him?" A creature without a corporeal body crawled out of the medallion. It was a clot of dark haze with an eye in the middle. The monster introduced himself as Moros and added that he was a very ancient noble spirit. The young man pointed his finger at the spirit and asked if he really got out of the necklace. Moros asked to be a little more polite and call him by name. The spirit then said that he knew that the guy had a lot of questions and wanted to find answers to them, and looked at him slyly, which made Cassian feel uncomfortable. They went out into the yard, and the guy asked Moros how he brought him back to life after he died at sea. Moros replied that he had already told this several times. Moros said that Jeff gave the necklace to Cassian to protect him. Cassian thought about this because before his death, his friend warned him about something and asked him to run as far as possible. He asked Moros what Jeff was looking for. If he remembered correctly, it was some kind of iron ancient sword. Moros replied that it was the Sword of Destruction. It was made back in the era of myths. Cassian asked Moros how he knew the sword was made so long ago. He replied that he was an ancient spirit. The guy didn't believe him and called it nonsense, and the spirit said that if he doesn't know something, he should shut up and listen. Cassian looked at the phone, and without paying much attention to Moros, asked why he should trust him. The spirit replied that, in fact, he was the victim in this situation, since he had to use half of his power to revive Cassian. The young man answered with an indifferent look that it was funny to him that the spirit called himself a victim, and then sharply opened his eyes in surprise. He looked at the latest news on his phone, which said that the famous psyker Cassian was involved in black traffic. Cassian was very angry that Lampus made it look like he was the one who killed Jeff, his friend, for whom he wanted to avenge. He would never do this in his life. He shouted that the Lampas were disgusting, that he had worked for them for so many years, risked himself to protect people, and this was their payment to him. Moros got nervous and asked Cassian to calm down, otherwise he would now transform. The guy was enveloped in blue flames, tattoos spread across his body, his hands turned into black clawed paws, one eye burned with a yellow light, the other blue. Cassian did not understand what happened and demanded an explanation. In one of the alleys, behind the school, there was a gang of school hooligans who had earlier drowned the unfortunate Quan Kang in the toilet. A plump boy with big glasses ran towards them. They called him a bore and a freak. This was the guy they bullied, but he acted as their helper, so he wouldn't get beaten up as much. He told the hooligans that there was no one in the toilet. Then they asked if the police or ambulance were at the scene. The boy replied that it was completely empty. One of the bullies started yelling at the one who had the bat in his hands, that he had convinced them that Quan Kang Wu wasn't breathing, so why was he still alive? He didn't know what to answer. He actually leaned over him in the toilet and checked. He really wasn't breathing. There was no doubt about that. The guys continued to press their friend that he didn't check properly, and now he can't be trusted. The third said that there is no point in swearing and arguing. Well, Quan is not in the toilet, and no. They turned and asked, what should they do now? The third said that they would simply find him and finish him off completely. Cassian climbed onto the roof of the school. It seems that all the students did this when they wanted to be alone with their thoughts. Moros said it was a great decision. The guy started screaming at the spirit to shut up. In fact, he was forced to run away here so that no one on the street would see his transformation. He asked the spirit to explain why he became a villain. Moros said he was starting to regret his decision because of the guy's volatility and aggression. He said that Cassian's fate changed because he managed to die and be reborn again. But the owner of this body was destined to awaken as a villain. His abilities have huge catastrophic consequences. Cassian lost his breath, and in shock repeated the words, that the abilities have catastrophic consequences. Was it possible that, having been reborn, he took over the fate of this guy? Moros replied that this was indeed the case. Cassian laughed at the absurdity of the whole situation, that a top-class psyker had become a villain, and his capabilities were destructive. He punched the wall behind him and left a large dent in it. Then Cassian was overcome with panic and anger, and he began to shout at Moros. Why did he even revive him? The spirit told the young man that he must control himself, but he did not listen to him and demanded to shut up. Moros said that Cassian himself should know that villains are controlled by their desires, like Ralph, the guy's last enemy, who loved money and robbed people. And right now, these desires and weaknesses took possession of him. Evil itself was now inside Cassian. Cassian looked at Moros and fell silent. The spirit told him that at the moment it was helping to restrain the evil, but the more angry he became, the more evil was inside him. It grew, along with the rage. And then, the young man lost his breath and asked not to say what would happen next. He covered his face with his hands and asked what should he do. He fell into despair, but Moros told him that no matter what, he must continue to live. Jeff would say that too. Cassian asked Moros what he knew about this. The spirit replied that he and Jeff often talked about him. He was very sorry that he had to drag Cassian into this matter, and although he felt death approaching, he did not plan to save himself. He just wanted Cassian to have a chance to survive. That was his last wish. After Moros' story, Cassian wilted and sat silently, continuing to cover his face with his hands. The spirit told the guy that he needed to learn to control himself. Then, the young man irritably demanded that the monster stop giving him advice. Then Moros asked if he himself didn't want to regain his human appearance. How long will you have to sit on this roof? Sooner or later, you need to cool down. The young man finally agreed with the spirit. When Cassian finally calmed down and regained his normal appearance, he asked Moros what it meant that he was an ancient noble spirit. The spirit asked with a sly expression whether he was really so interested in finding out. The guy honestly answered that yes, since he knew how to revive people, he was interested in learning about his abilities and origin. Moros replied that he would find out everything as soon as he found the sword. Then Cassian, calling the sword a piece of metal, asked Moros what he had to do with the murder of Jeff. Moros did not know this, but he was sure that it was so. At that moment, a group of school bullies climbed onto the roof, and calling him a moron, they said that now it would be the end of him. They were glad to see that he was still alive, since they could still get even on him. A tall guy with red hair and earrings was walking along the school corridor. The girls looked at him and whispered to each other that he was handsome and had a strong body. He was a trainee psyker named Kim Woo-chan. He didn't care about the people around him. He was walking, immersed in his thoughts, when suddenly he received a call from Lee Daeun, the senior psyker who trained him. He asked the mentor what happened, and while he was talking with him, he noticed in the window that there were several students on the roof of the building opposite, and it seemed that there was a conflict between them. Cassian remembered, thanks to the memory of the owner of the body, that these were the same guys who drowned him in the toilet. And now, seeing that he was alive, they came to investigate. As soon as Cassian thought about Moros, he himself told him that there was no need to worry, and no one saw or heard him except the guy himself, on whose neck there was a necklace. One of the bullies made a claim to Cassian that because he survived, he is setting them up and they don't want to go to jail because of his dead body. The leader of the group, taking a cigarette out of the pack and putting it in his mouth, told Cassian, calling him Quan Khan, that he was really annoying him and asked if he survived. Then why didn't he immediately go to them? Did you really decide to hide on the roof? Cassian did not even stand on ceremony and pretend that he knew them and play the role of Quan Kanu. He honestly said that he didn't know them, showered them with insults, and said that he was not in the mood to deal with them now. Moros told Cassian that the villains, even without transformation, have enormous physical strength, which is several times greater than that of any person. And if he starts fighting with these guys now without controlling himself, then big consequences could happen. Cassian replied that he understood this perfectly well. One of the guys approached him and indignantly asked what he just blurted out in their direction. He decided that Quan Kon Wu had hit his head and was going crazy for daring to be insolent to them. Cassian looked the guy straight in the eyes with the most indifferent expression on his face. This made the blonde even angrier and screamingly asked why he was staring at him. He then swung to hit Cassian, but he was faster. The blow was lightning fast and landed right in the face. The blonde immediately fell to the floor, losing consciousness. The other two hooligans stood, shocked by the situation, and Cassian, taking a fighting stance, was already waiting to fight with them. The guy with the cigarette was surprised that this wimp had suddenly acquired so much strength. The main thing was where. After all, he had never been able to fight them back before. The guy with the beat swore and ran towards Quan Konu, shouting that his end would come now. Cassian blocked the blow of the bat with his own hand and then struck with the fist of his other hand. The guy with glasses immediately flew to the ground, passing out like the first one. Their leader began to fear, how did this guy knock out his friends in one fell swoop? It became even scarier that they would now attack him. Cassian asked the leader of the group how the three of them were not tormented by conscience for their actions. The guy did not answer, and then Cassian asked him why he was silent. The leader smiled ominously, then laughed and asked what is conscience. He doesn't care about people or any remorse. He pretended to be confident and told his opponent that he was going to beat him up now. Cassian calmly judged that this guy had no conscience at all, and then he added that since she doesn't exist, we need to make sure she appears, and his fist will help perfectly with this. An ominous aura emanated from Cassian, his eyes sparkling. The bully got into a fighting stance, and Cassian ran at him to make the first blow. He dodged the bully's blow, and a fist hit us from below in the jaw, after which he hit us a second time in the stomach. The guy screamed in pain, grabbed his stomach, and falling to his knees, bent in half, but did not lose consciousness. Cassian asked him if his conscience had begun to emerge. He just continued to call him names, despite his loss. Cassian grabbed him by the collar of his t-shirt and said that apparently the blow was not strong enough, since he continued to insult people instead of admitting his weakness and starting to ask for forgiveness. He intended to hit him again, but then a new voice, reaching them somewhere behind, asked what they were doing. Both guys turned around and saw the same psyker trainee named Kim Woo-chan. The bully recognized the school star and was afraid because he knew that he was very strong. Cassian let the guy go and asked the psyker why he was interfering in their personal affairs. Wu-chang asked Quan Kong if he was really going to beat someone who was several times weaker than him. The bully was surprised and thought, was the guy whom he humiliated for so long really so much stronger than him? This made him very angry and ran at him from behind, intending to hit him. Cassian turned around sharply and kicked the bully in the chest. He flew several meters and fell to the floor. Wu-chan grabbed Cassian by the shoulder and told him to stop. The guy began to get angry that another guy began to climb on him before he had time to deal with the previous ones. He turned his body and hit him with his elbow, but noticed that he grouped himself and parried his blow, crossing his own arms. Cassian launched several more blows, but Ushkan dodged each of them, moving back and forth with lightning speed. Then the red-haired man kicked, but Cassian barely had time to dodge the lunge, crouching and pressing his head into his shoulders. He thought to himself that this guy was very fast. Moros said that Cassian's opponent was a psyker, and if he loses to him now, it will be the end for him. The young man was distracted by the spirit's speech and turned away. Uchkan took advantage of the moment and hit where the guy's face should have been. But Cassian immediately came to his senses, turned sideways and took a step back, causing the enemy's hand to hit only the air next to his face. The fist was close and managed to touch Cassian's wine with its knuckles, and blood flowed from the scratch. He cursed to himself and began to think about how to defeat the psyker. They again stood in fighting stances and began to look into each other's eyes, waiting to see who would be the first to strike again. But Wu Cheng said sharply that there had been enough fighting for today, and if they continued, it would only get worse for both of them. He handed the bandage to Cassian and said that he had hurt himself. The guy never expected that his opponent, who himself had injured him, would hand him a band-aid to cover the scratch on his face. He did not want to express gratitude, silently snatched the gift from his hands, turned around, and walked towards the exit from the roof. Uchan looked after him and thought that this mysterious guy managed to knock out 3 hooligans at once. And why didn't he notice before that there was such a strong student at their school? He then raised his elbow and looked at his forearm. It was red after he blocked Quan Khan's blow. It was really strong, since not everyone could hit a psyker so that it would leave a bruise. This interested Uchan. After school, Cassian went to the computer club, a place in Korea and other Asian countries where you can come and sit in front of a powerful computer, play games, or study if you can't do it at home. He wanted to log into his psyker account because he was not recognized as dead. He was only missing in action, and the Lampus organization blacklisted him. Still, he hoped that access would be allowed, but wow, his page was blocked. He felt bad and didn't know what to do next. After buying a snack, he went into an alley to talk to Moros without prying eyes. Otherwise, people would look at him strangely that he was communicating with air. Scrolling through the feed on his phone, he asked the spirit how he knew that the guy on the roof turned out to be a psyker. Moros replied that he determined this by the energy waves at the moment when he touched Cassian's shoulder. The guy said that this was an interesting ability, and the spirit said that he could do more than that. If he had read that psyker's color scheme, he would have learned more information about him. Cassian asked the monster how he knew such words and terms. Moros replied that he was an ancient noble spirit who lives and is imbued with the knowledge of generations. Then he asked the young man if he wanted to turn into the form of a villain. After all, it's better to know about your capabilities in advance. Cassian was silent. Then Moros asked him if he really didn't want to, and the guy replied that this was indeed so. Apparently, while remaining a psyker at heart, a hero who opposes evil, he did not yet want to join it. He didn't want to, but he knew he had to do it, to find out what the essence of the villain's power is. He asked Moros what needs to be done for this. The spirit replied that evildoers come from an inability to control the 5 desires and 7 senses. The young man quietly commented that the spirit was once again talking some incomprehensible nonsense. Moros continued and said that in the case of Cassian, and rather with the body of Quan Konu, the trigger is anger. Cassian clenched his fist and deliberately remembered how Jeff was killed, how he fought with the traitors who killed him. He tried to regain the feelings that he felt at that moment and get angry again. As the recent events flashed through his mind, he furiously shouted, "Lampas idiots, I will kill you all." But he failed to transform. This desire was already conscious, reasonable, and turned into a goal towards which he was moving, being calm and cold. It is not so easy to awaken rage and anger in himself. Morris asked the guy what he was doing. He replied that this was his way of showing anger. Then the spirit said that it was not necessary to scream. It was enough to feel it inside. Cassian said irritably that this could have been warned about right away.